You are listening to the GetGlobal podcast, a weekly journey into the international business landscape with leaders, knowers, and doers from around the world who share their stories and insights on the issues that matter most. GetGlobal brings you the best to help you thrive in foreign markets. Thank you for joining us. I am Julian Leuthold, the CEO and founder of GetGlobal, and this week we have with us Glen Fukushima of the Center for American Progress. He has been, among other things, the negotiator in the Reagan administration to Japan on trade. He has been an executive for numerous companies in Japan, among them Airbus and AT&T and others. And today he is going to be speaking to us about the phenomena that has been splashed across headlines in the United States and internationally about what is going on with North Korea, Northeast Asia, dynamics with trade, and what to expect in coming months with all of these very important headline issues. So thank you for joining us, Glen.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here.
Glad to have you, especially at a time when so many questions are circulating about what any of this stuff means. From a negotiator's point of view, what do you think Jong Un is thinking right now?
Well, I left Washington, D.C. last week, and I'm here in Tokyo, and certainly there's been a tremendous amount of attention being given to the fact that President Trump has agreed in his meeting with the South Korean representatives to meet with President Kim. And according to the news accounts, it's going to take place sometime before the end of May. There's still a lot of unanswered questions as to where they're going to meet. And also, actually, there hasn't actually been a clear confirmation from North Korea that the meeting is going to take place. But assuming that the meeting is going to take place, I would think, although very few people know for certain, that Mr. Kim's main priority, his main concern is regime survival. He wants to make sure that his regime survives, just as his father and his grandfather were in control of North Korea. So I think the highest priority is for him to negotiate an agreement with the president of the United States that will ensure the survival of the regime. Therefore, basically get the U.S. to say, okay, we're not going to try to change the regime, change the government of North Korea or to attack North Korea. That's, I think, the highest priority that he has. And so in addition to regime survival, and part of that actually would be economic assistance, because with all the sanctions that have been put in place, plus given all the natural disasters and given the economy and how it's been dysfunctional in North Korea, that there's tremendous disparities of wealth. The per capita income is very low. Recent defector, a soldier in North Korea from North Korea, was found to be full of parasites because of the health conditions in North Korea. So I think the package of what's on Kim's mind is regime survival and economic sustainability.
So what do you think compelled, so we still don't know what exactly was said by the North Koreans, according to the North Koreans. This is all coming through the South Koreans. But assuming that what they recount is exactly what happened, what do you think is motivating all of this from the North Koreans?
Well, I think the North Koreans know that with all the sanctions in place, both from the United States and Japan and multilaterally through the United Nations, that the economic conditions in North Korea aren't going to get any better. And the United States certainly is trying to get China to help. And China is clearly the biggest economic supporter of North Korea. So it's certainly not in China's interest to see the regime collapse in North Korea, because the last thing China wants to see is for unified Korean Peninsula under the control of the South. And that would clearly be a unfriendly country, at least politically, on China's borders. So, I think that North Korea wants to find a way to, as I say, sustain its regime, and I think they see an opportunity here. I think they see an opening, and I think that actually my reading is that Kim and his people have really read well Donald Trump, because at least the press accounts indicate that the way in which the North Koreans put it to the South Koreans to convey to President Trump is that if Kim and Trump were to meet, that could produce some real results. And when that was put in those terms to President Trump, Trump apparently said, "Fine, I'm happy to meet with the guy." So I think that the North Koreans see an opportunity here, precisely because Trump has been so critical of past administrations, whether it's the Obama administration, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, for their failure, in his view, of dealing with the North Korean nuclear issue, the missile issue, and so forth. So I think Trump has been basically saying that I can solve the problem if given the opportunity, and Kim sees an opening here to appeal to Trump's ego, for one thing. And I think Trump believes that he could have a historic meeting, because this will be the first time in history since the start of the North Korean regime that the head of state of North Korea and the head of state of the United States will meet.
Do you think that calculation on the part of the North Koreans is sincere and accurate? Do you feel that this is an opening for them to actually get something done?
Well, I think the North Koreans have always wanted to be recognized as a legitimate state. And having a meeting between the leader of North Korea and President of the United States is a huge achievement, major accomplishment in terms of North Korea's emergence on the world scene, being seen as a legitimate player. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that is precisely the reason why a number of Americans and others have been rather reluctant or critical, actually, of the president for agreeing to meet without clear preconditions and without groundwork. I mean, I think, generally speaking, the traditional way of doing this would be, and this would be what Trump would be critical of, is to have some lower level officials, mid-level to higher level officials. I mean, the classic case would be Richard Nixon sending Kissinger to China in 1971 to start to pave the way for normalization of relations. And so the normal course would be to send a person that the president trusts to North Korea to have some secret meetings to, decide on the agenda, decide on the time frame, decide on the place, decide on all the parameters of the discussion, and then to have the heads of state meet. But the approach that's now being taken is to bypass all of that and go directly from the top. And so that carries some real risks because obviously if the two sides don't agree, there's no place else no place higher they can go. But I guess both sides are, at least at this point, it appears both sides are willing to take that risk.
And it also seems that South Korea thinks this is a good idea. Why do you feel that this is so important to them, whereas in prior situations, because this has been a long-standing request of the North Koreans, why is this time different?
Well, it all has to do with the regime in South Korea. I mean, the current President Moon is a president who basically comes as his background is a civil rights attorney, a human rights attorney, and he was an assistant to one of the previous governments of South Korea that had pursued a sunshine policy. I mean, there's been, as you know, in South Korea, kind of an alternation of administrations over time. A bit like, even actually more different, I would say, than between a Republican and Democratic administration in the United States, where over the last, I'd say, probably 20, 30 years or so, starting with Kim Dae-jung, there have been governments in South Korea, elected, democratically elected governments in South Korea that have a different stance towards North Korea. And there are some that have taken a very open, liberal, a harmonious approach towards North Korea, thinking that dialogue and economic and cultural and social and other intercourse will result in more openness on the part of the North, and eventually, over time, unification. And then there's been other governments of South Korea that have had a much more confrontational approach and much more suspicious approach towards North Korea, and have refused to engage in that kind of a way with the North. And so we've had this transition just within the last several months, where President Park, the daughter of Park Chung-hee, longtime president of Korea back in the 60s and 70s. So this Park government was a government that tended to be rather critical of the North and suspicious of the North. But then, as a result of her being impeached and being driven out of office, and a new government coming into place, the current government, the Moon government, is in part because of the leader, President Moon, much more open and optimistic about having good relations with the North. So he has really tried, working with the United States, with China, with Japan, to try to find some way to engage with the North. And the North sees this as a real opportunity, because they see now a potentially friendly government in the South. And so I think that's what's really motivated the current situation. The combination of, it's a combination of a number of things. One is the regime change in the South, which is more favorable towards the North. The sanctions, which are putting more pressure on the North. The United States asking China for greater cooperation, putting pressure on the North. And the fact that the new president of the United States is someone who's willing to do something that's totally out of the box, which has never been tried before.
So it seems in the Northeast Asia Wonka sphere, this issue has really divided people into two camps. The traditional continental diplomacy style folks are really against all of this. They feel that that the battle on Korea's side has already been won. They're being rewarded with something that they've been seeking for a very, very long time, and it's all downhill from here for them. The others are kind of looking at this and saying, well, this might just be crazy enough to work. You have two people who are similar potentially, or you have people who are spontaneous enough, or who have a similar kind of decision-making style. They like to make their own decisions in that moment, impulsive perhaps. I guess that maybe more reading of Trump than perhaps of Kim Jong Un, although that might be projected on him. But there is an opportunity here for these two people to try something that hasn't been done before, and which could potentially yield something. And perhaps it's not so much a matter of just as significant could be cultural reasons, right? These are cultures in Northeast Asia that value top-down decision making, and perhaps middle up or bottom up may not have been working. Where do you find yourself in that spectrum? Are you closer to the traditional side, which I think is probably far outnumbering the others, or do you feel that there could be an unconventional chance here for something?
Well, I'm kind of in between, in the sense that I think that there is a real opportunity here. And so I think it's good to take advantage of the fact that these new set of circumstances will allow for this meeting to take place. So I'm not actually opposed to the fact that the meeting would take place. However, I'm enough of a traditionalist to believe that it takes time, it takes preparation, it takes expertise to get something done. And therefore, what I'm a little afraid of is that, given the short time span between now and the meeting, also given the fact that we're going to have a new Secretary of State very soon, and based on the news accounts this morning, we're going to have a new head of the National Security Council very soon. And there is no Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific yet confirmed in the U.S. government. There is no U.S. ambassador to South Korea even nominated at this point. So the U.S. side really lacks expertise, knowledge, and experience with regard to North Korea. And having had a lot of experience dealing with Asia, I think it's essential that the U.S. have people in place who have the experience and the knowledge and the expertise to be able to, first of all, negotiate, but also to make sure that the negotiations result in something that is meaningful and productive for the United States. So I am very concerned about that. And for that reason, I don't oppose the fact that they're going to meet, but I just think that they need to do a lot of preparation in advance and actually have, especially on the U.S. side, some people who know what they're doing. Now, I can guarantee you that the North Koreans have been monitoring Donald Trump and his administration, analyzing it minutely, and they're watching CNN all the time. They're reading the newspapers, and they really have a good grasp of what's going on in the United States. I don't, frankly, believe that the U.S. side has that level of understanding about North Korea.
So in the absence of all of the key officials that would typically play a role in preparing negotiations like this, what do you think is going to be the likely chain reaction or normal course of events without that? Do you think that, consular or rather embassy officials in any of those capitals will be called upon and will have the same degree of working relationship? Will perhaps some of this fall into, I don't know, even, the Department of Defense or something? I mean, what would be, without those key personalities to weigh in, what would be the likely, process that you think will be that will be used in that?
I think there's two problems. There's two problems. One is that because North Korea has been so isolated and so impenetrable, the normal sources of information the U.S. would have, which would include journalists, business people, military people, intelligence agencies, they don't have the kind of detailed information about North Korea that we would normally have about other more open countries, number one. Number two, I think that this administration, and the president in particular, is someone who distrusts the bureaucracy, as we've seen in the case of the State Department. And therefore, there's a tendency not to rely on the people in place because they're kind of seen with suspicion as the people who have kind of brought us to where we are now. And so, I think the thinking among people around Trump is that, we're in this mess with North Korea with the nuclear and all this missile stuff because the previous administration allowed this to happen. They didn't do what was necessary to prevent this. And so from that point of view, they're not likely to trust the diplomats. So I think the most likely scenario is that because Mike Pompeo is going to become new Secretary of State and he's from the CIA, that I would expect that the intelligence agencies are the ones that are going to have the most influence in terms of what information the president will rely on. Because, as I say, the other sources of information are just not there when compared to other countries. But again, I do think that I'm not aware of anybody right now, other than in the intelligence agencies, who, whether National Security Council or in the State Department or the Department of Defense or in the, who are political appointees who have, could say, read Korean and can look at, primary sources and understand what's going on within North Korea, the power relations within North Korea, what's going on in the mind of Kim Jong Un, what his real goals and intentions are. So when they have their first meeting, unless they have a lot of groundwork in preparation, it's going to be very unconventional. And the other thing too is that, if you think, well, what's the likely outcome of this? You can be extremely optimistic and say, okay, here are two leaders who really want to get something done, and therefore maybe we can expect something out of this that would be positive for both sides. That would, for instance, take us away from the potential option of a military strike by the United States or by North Korea. That's one extreme. The other extreme is that you could find these two people come together. They find actually that they don't agree on anything. That each side has certain demands and requirements the other side can't meet. So they part their ways, and we're actually worse off. And actually, there are some people who suspect that perhaps part of the calculation by the president is he needs an excuse to have to pursue a military option. And this is one way for him to say, okay, we're going to have a meeting. And I tried my best, I tried my level best to persuade this guy, but he just didn't listen. And therefore, the only option we have is to go with a military strike. Now, nobody knows at this point what the final outcome of this meeting is going to be. But to the extent that the president has repeatedly said, all options are on the table, we're not taking anything off, that military option still seems to be there. And as you well know, with the withdrawal of Victor Cha from consideration to be ambassador to South Korea, although his name had been in place since summer of last year or the fall of last year, I think and the fact that now it appears that most of the people being considered to be ambassador to South Korea by the administration are ex-military people. I think there are some who believe that that this meeting that the president has agreed to could be a pretext for, if it fails, a kind of a military operation.
Now, if we put ourselves in Kim Jong Un's position, and how old is he? Maybe 31. He's leading this country. He knows that this has been a long-standing, terribly difficult issue to make any progress on, assuming that, that he wants to get something done. Do you see that, or do you feel that he actually, that his goal will be to get something meaningful accomplished rather than simply being legitimized, or perhaps he sees this as a rare opening to do something unusual? And I ask this mainly because, of course, North Koreans are famous for surprises and surprise interpretations of things, and he has to be watching what's going on with the hardliners taking a stronger position within the administration, the way that the administration is conducting its decisions. He has to be looking at that and thinking, well, I'll leave it to you. What do you think he's thinking?
Well, I don't know, and most people, I think, don't really understand and know what is the real thinking of Kim Jong Un. But the impression one gets looking at it from the outside is that he is a long-term strategist. He's not a crazy guy. I think he's quite rational. He's been able to achieve a lot during the time he's been in office. And I think that he looks at this as a long-term play. And so I don't think that he looks at this meeting as a one-shot deal. I think he sees it as part of a process. And if you take the negative approach, just as you can take a negative approach towards Donald Trump and say, well, he's just going to use this as an excuse to say, okay, we failed, we have only the military option. You can also take the alternative approach and say, well, from Kim's point of view, this is a way to string along the U.S. Basically, he's been very successful, and his father has been was very successful, in basically making promises, making commitments, and actually never fulfilling them. And so you could say, one interpretation would be that his whole goal here is to have a meeting, play up to the president's ego, make him feel good, make him think that he's achieved something, and then use the remaining several months or years that he's bought to develop further the missile and nuclear capability. So that, that's certainly one way of looking at it. One really doesn't fully know where Kim is going to try to take this. The optimistic scenario, as I mentioned before, is that there are two leaders that want to try something new, and they're actually interested in getting something done. And Kim is genuinely interested in getting an agreement with the United States that will guarantee regime survival, have a kind of a no attack, first strike agreement from the United States, and in return, the U.S. gets something. Now, what the U.S. and that's the other question too. I mean, what is it that the U.S. wants to achieve? From the U.S. point of view, I think many would argue that what we really want to achieve is denuclearization of the peninsula, meaning that we want to get the North Koreans to get rid of both the nuclear capability and the missile capability. On the other hand, we've had some indication, some comments by the president in the last several months that the level of development they have right now, that's a problem for the region, but it's not yet a problem for the United States because they don't have the ICBMs and that have the accuracy at this point, the range or the accuracy to be able to pinpoint attacks on the U.S. mainland. And there's one possibility that in the mind of the president, it may be, well, if we can get them to freeze the current situation, that would be sufficient because that would mean we're okay. The mainland U.S. is okay. Now, certainly, Japan would not be happy with that because Japan, even now, is within the range of the attack if North Korea chooses to make an attack, a nuclear attack. So, that whole question of what is it that the U.S. wants to achieve is still something that, it's not clear what's the bottom line for the administration.
So the reason why, and I'm glad we're shifting to Japan, is because that's what you spend most of your time researching. You mentioned in your recent article in New York Review of Books that much of the discussion between Prime Minister Abe and President Trump has been focused on North Korea and what to do about it. And to what degree do you think Abe's, feelings, sentiments, advice have trickled into, any of the calculations that have been going on in the White House since those meetings started taking place? Because it's not only just the acceptance of this meeting, but there's been a lot of activity regarding North Korea, from sanctions to, making threats and things like that. Where does Japan sit in all of this, and particularly Abe?
Sure. So, less than 2 weeks after the election of November 8th of 2016, Prime Minister Abe, on the 17th of November, visited President-elect Trump in Trump Tower and had about a 1-hour meeting with him, more than an hour meeting. And he was the first foreign leader to meet face-to-face with the newly elected President of the United States. And that was a very good meeting from all accounts, from both sides. And also on the 10th of February, Prime Minister Abe went to Washington, D.C., had a meeting with the president, then went to Mar-a-Lago together, played golf. And actually, while they were in Mar-a-Lago, Jong Un had a missile launching. And so that forced Abe and Trump to have a hastily prepared press conference in Mar-a-Lago to express the solidarity of the United States and Japan against North Korea. And ever since that time, there have been about 20 telephone calls between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe about North Korea, primarily. And so there have been more telephone calls between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe than any world leader that the president has had phone calls with. And clearly, there's been a lot of discussion about North Korea. And clearly, Japan has a lot of information about North Korea. And so I'm sure that the Prime Minister has provided a lot of input to the president. To what extent the president accepts them is not clearly known. One area where there is some divergence between the two is the fact that Japan has its own unique issues with North Korea regarding this issue of the abductions. There have been, several dozens of Japanese who've been abducted by the North Koreans and basically used to be teachers for spies that they would send into Japan. And this whole issue of the abductees and the abductees' families is a very emotional issue, and an issue that Prime Minister Abe has actually focused on as part of, the growth of his political career. And so he's had this group of families and their supporters, and also other politicians who really focused on this issue. So clearly, that's one of the issues that he will be asking the president to include in his discussions with Kim. Whether President Trump agrees with that, nobody knows. But it is true that when Trump visited Japan in November last year, he did agree to meet with the families of the victims, those who were abducted. So I think that on the nuclear and missile issue as well, I think Abe wants to make sure that Trump goes not for a freeze, but for a denuclearization. And I think there are other areas in which the prime minister will want to make sure that the president is fully informed and has the understanding of where the Japanese interests lie. My sense is that up to this point, Trump and Abe have had, as the president says, very good chemistry. And among all the leaders, including allies, that Trump has met with, Abe seems to be among the people he likes. There have been some recent interesting articles just within the last couple of days about some of the potential business discussions that have taken place and actually have occurred between Japan and the United States as a result of this close relationship between the president and the prime minister. So it does seem that the president, has a willingness to listen to the prime minister, and the prime minister and many in Japan take a lot of pride in ownership on this whole notion of the free and open Indo-Pacific, because that issue, that nomenclature, that term, Indo-Pacific, is something that Prime Minister Abe and Deputy Prime Minister Aso have been focusing on for the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 years, and or even more. When Aso was Prime Minister, he also was interested in this kind of quadrilateral relationship between the U.S., Japan, Indonesia, India, and Australia, as a way to get democracies working together in Asia. And depending on which of the four you talk to, you have a slightly different response to the question. Well, is this meant to contain China? But in any case, this notion of the Indo-Pacific is something that has been pushed and promoted by Japan, and it appears that Rex Tillerson, in his speech at the CSIS before going to India, and Trump before going to Asia in November, both bought on to this notion of Indo-Pacific. So I think there clearly are indications that Prime Minister Abe has had some influence on the president.
So we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to quickly touch two hot items also in the middle of all this, and one in particular that has specific relevance to business. What's Japan making of all of these developments in light of the steel and aluminum tariffs? There's also a lot going on with China and tariffs there. There's just a tremendous amount to be balancing out. What is the reaction in Japan to all of this?
Sure. As you said, there are a lot of moving parts, and I think that many people in Japan, including the prime minister, were very concerned during the presidential campaign in the U.S., that candidate Trump was talking about slapping tariffs on Japan, on China, and various other countries, and then after becoming president, the president has repeated that he wants the economic relationship between the U.S. and other countries, including Japan, to be free, fair, and reciprocal, with the emphasis on reciprocal. And so the whole notion of bilateral versus multilateral, withdrawing from the TPP, focusing on trade imbalances, those are all things that concern people in Japan. Also, the renegotiation of NAFTA is something that's concerning people in Japan because of the implications that could have on Japanese automakers in both Mexico and Canada. So there is a lot of concern. And with regard to the steel and aluminum tariffs, Japan has certainly made the request to the administration that it be exempted because it is an ally. And the whole basis of the 232 action is it's basically national security. And so the Japanese argument, along with the arguments by the EU and by Germany and by Canada and the other allies of the United States, is, hey, this is a national security reason that you're using to put tariffs, but we are your allies. So maybe China may be a national security problem for you, but why should we? So certainly Japan is trying to persuade the U.S. to take it off the list. And the president has agreed to have a 30-day extension with regard to Mexico and Canada pending the results of the NAFTA negotiations. And there are indications in the press, although not fully confirmed, that Prime Minister Trumbull of Australia has managed to persuade the president to take Australia off the list as well. But Japan, at this point, has not gotten assurances of that result.
Last question. There's a scandal that's been boiling for a while that has had a new development, the Maury Tomogakuen scandal about falsified, depending on which publication you read, documents altered in other newspapers. How serious is this?
It could be quite serious because, although, as you say, the scandal has been brewing for the last year or so, it's only within the last week that it's become proven, it's become established that some of the documents that had been supplied by the Ministry of Finance to the Diet, to the National Parliament, were falsified documents. And so this is now creating a situation where the opposition parties are demanding that some of the Ministry of Finance officials, including Mr. Sagawa, who testified in the Diet before, they believe that he basically lied under oath, and so they're trying to bring him back. And it appears now that the LDP, the ruling party, has more or less agreed to have that person come back to testify, but it's the terms of that are not yet fully clear under what legal status he's going to testify. And the opposition parties are asking for the wife of the prime minister, Akie Abe, to also testify in the Diet because her name appears in the documents that were falsified. And she actually was at one point an honorary chairman of the school that allegedly, was able to buy land at 1/8 the price of what it was the original price. And allegedly because of the fact that it was certain political leaders, such as the prime minister and his wife and others who were friends of the owners of this school that was applying for the land purchase. So to answer your question, I think this just within the last week has turned into a much bigger issue than had been thought. And so now the question of who testifies, who agrees to testify. The other is Deputy Prime Minister Aso, who is also the Minister of Finance. He is the person who is at the top of the organization, the Ministry of Finance, which has allegedly done these doctoring or falsification of documents. And so there are some who are arguing that he should take responsibility and resign. So far, he's resisted that and saying that it's not politicians who are involved, it's just the bureaucrats who are doctoring the documents. And then there are some who believe that the prime minister himself, both because he is heading the government and also because his wife was implicated, that he should resign. So there's a lot of uncertainties. And as you say, in September of this year, there's going to be an election for the head of the ruling party, the Liberal Democratic Party. The person who becomes the head of the party usually becomes the prime minister. And currently, the head of the party is Prime Minister Abe. He's had 2 3-year terms. He actually had the rules of the LDP changed so that now they allow for 3 3-year terms. So if he runs and is reelected in September to be president of the party, he could be prime minister of Japan until 2021 for another 3 years. So these 9 years, plus 1 year he served between 2006 2007, if you add those, that would mean he would be will have been prime minister for 10 years, which is longer than any prime minister in Japanese history. In 1885, Japan adopted the prime minister system, and he would be the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history if he is reelected in September of this year. But now with this scandal, it's not clear whether he would run, and if he ran, whether he would be reelected. So it does add a huge element of uncertainty.
Well, it seems like every place in the world has intense headlines all the time now. So I guess Japan is no this is no outlier here. So we'll be watching with interest. And Glenn, thank you so much for joining us. Okay. We'll be talking to you again soon. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to find out more about our events and get more global intel every week, sign up for our newsletter at getglobal.co.